Hello, this is Matt Dean with A Plus College Ready, and I'm here today to talk with you about pedigrees and how to determine the mode of inheritance when given a pedigree. Before we get started, we need to make sure you know the definitions of some important terms. First one is, what is a pedigree? It's a diagram that shows the lineage or the genealogy of an individual and all of his or her direct ancestors, and it's usually used to follow the inheritance of a trait through a family. One of the things you're going to be asked to do in this activity is to determine the mode of inheritance of a trait from a pedigree. The mode of inheritance is the manner in which a genetic trait or a disorder is passed from generation to generation. Some examples of modes of inheritance are autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, Y-linked, and mitochondrial inheritance. We mentioned autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive traits. An autosome is a non-sex chromosome. A human typically has 44 autosomes per diploid, somatic, or body cell. Also, we need to know what an X chromosome is. Humans have two sex chromosomes, an X and a Y. The X chromosome is one of those. Females typically have two X chromosomes per somatic cell, while males only usually have one per somatic cell. Another term is to talk about linkage or gene linkage. If we say a gene is linked with another gene, or if we say it's linked to a particular chromosome, that simply means it's found on that chromosome with other chromosomes that are also, or with other genes rather, that are also on that chromosome. All right, here are some symbols that are commonly used with pedigree charts. A male is typically just shown as a square, a female as a circle. Two individuals that are mating are connected through their centers with a horizontal line, like so. Notice that the parents, here are the parents, they're connected via this horizontal line by a vertical line to their children. So this family has a son and a daughter. Dizygotic twins, or we would call these fraternal twins, are shown like so. And monozygotic twins, or identical twins, are shown like this. If an individual is affected by a particular disease, and that's what the pedigree is set up to show, if they're actually affected, their shape is going to be completely colored in. If they're a carrier for the trait, oftentimes you'll see the shape half shaded, especially if it's an autosomal trait. If it's a sex-linked trait, or sometimes autosomal, you might also see carriers or heterozygotes shown with just a dot in the middle. If an individual in your pedigree is deceased, you'll see a line drawn through their shape. If the baby was miscarried or suffered a spontaneous abortion, you might see a triangle, and that's often because the sex may not be known. This is showing you what happens when two related individuals mate. So this would be sort of an incest kind of situation. A couple more symbols that we need to look like are going to be present on the next slide. All right, so we'll also notice that adopted children are often shown with like a bracket put around their shape. If there's a divorce, you'll see sort of a broken line with two slashes through it between the two parents. If you have a multiple marriage situation where, in this case, one man has three different wives, you might see it shown like so. And if there's some kind of affair that gives rise to a child, you might see it with a dashed line between the father and the mother. So those are our typical pedigree symbols. Most important ones: circle for females, square for males, half shaded shape is a carrier, or maybe with a dot in the middle. And then a completely shaded shape means an individual is affected with whatever trait the pedigree is about. So now we want to look at some pedigrees, and we want to be able to look at the pedigree and determine the mode of inheritance. Before we actually look at pedigrees, let's talk about some of the different modes of inheritance. And let's start with autosomal dominant. These traits are autosomal, which means that the genes for the traits are carried on one of the non-sex chromosomes. And these traits are also dominant, which means for the symptoms to appear, there only has to be one gene. Since these traits are autosomal, males and females are equally likely to have the trait. These traits don't skip generations. There can't be any carriers. That's why they can't skip. Whenever an individual has one gene for the trait, they have the trait. Again, no carriers. And in this case, there is male-to-male transmission. What that means is that fathers can pass these traits on to their sons. They can also pass the traits on to daughters. Mothers can pass to sons. Mothers can pass to daughters. These traits have nothing to do with your gender. They're autosomal. All right, the next mode of inheritance we want to look at is autosomal recessive. Again, these traits are autosomal. Gender has nothing to do with how these traits are passed. These traits are recessive, which means in order for the symptoms of the trait to appear, an individual has to inherit a gene from both parents. Again, since the traits are autosomal, males and females are equally likely to have the trait. These traits can skip generations. And that's true because there can be individuals who are carriers. For example, let's say that this individual, since they have a big A gene, a dominant allele, and a recessive allele, they won't actually exhibit the symptoms of this trait since it's a recessive trait. Only homozygous individuals have the trait. So homozygous recessive individuals, like little a, for example. Traits can appear in siblings without appearing in the parents. Both the parents could be carriers, like so. But these two parents could have offspring that turned out to be homozygous recessive and therefore exhibit the trait. If a parent has a trait, let's say if a parent was little a, all of the children will either get the trait or, at a minimum, they'll be a carrier for the trait because they can only inherit this recessive allele from the affected parent. So those are autosomal recessive traits. Males and females are equally likely to get them. There can be carriers for the trait. Now we want to mention traits that are X-linked and dominant. These traits are X-linked. That means that the genes for the traits are located on the X chromosome. And because of that, males and females are going to be affected different ways, since men have only one X chromosome and women have two per somatic cell. These traits are also dominant, which means it only takes the presence of one allele for these traits for them to show symptoms. Females are more likely to inherit X-linked dominant traits, and that's because they inherit an X chromosome from mother or father, and it only takes one affected X to cause the symptoms to show up. Since these traits are X-linked, there is no male-to-male transmission. And this is due to the fact that men have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. They inherit the X chromosome from their mother. They inherit the Y from their father. They don't get an X from their father. So since the genes for these traits are located on an X chromosome, men can't pass X-linked traits on to sons. They can pass them on to daughters because daughters have two X chromosomes. They get one of those from mom and one of those from dad. A female who has one of these traits may or may not pass the gene for the trait to a son or daughter. Again, females are XX. A son gets an X from a mother, so does a daughter. So if assuming that the mother only has one affected X chromosome, there's a 50-50 chance that the child could inherit the trait from an affected mother. All of the daughters of a male with the trait will inherit the trait. Again, men are XY. If a man is affected, his X chromosome is affected with this particular trait. Any daughter that he has inherits this X, which means that she will automatically inherit the trait. Next, we'll look at the X-linked recessive mode of inheritance. These traits are far more common in males than females. Again, they're recessive, which means for a female to inherit this trait, she has to inherit it from both parents. But since men are XY, the Y has nothing to do with these traits. Men only have one X. they get that X from their mother. So men who are affected with an X-linked recessive trait inherited that trait from their mother. These traits can skip generations, since females can be carriers. All daughters of a male who has the trait are either going to be affected or they're going to be carriers, because the affected male, again, only has one X, and it has the trait. It's carrying the trait. The son of a female carrier has a 50% chance of having the trait. Again, women are XX. Sometimes you'll see genes notated on a chromosome as superscripts. So this particular X chromosome here is not affected. This one is. We know that because the little letter represents a recessive trait. A guy is a guy because he got an X from mom and a Y from dad. Well, mom has two versions of X that she can give him. So there's a 50% chance a male son will get this. There's also a 50% chance a male son will get this one. In this case, since the trait is X-linked, there is no male-to-male transmission. Men cannot pass these traits on to their sons because the genes for these traits are carried on an X chromosome. Men can pass these traits to their daughters. Women can pass these traits on to sons or daughters, but men cannot pass the traits on to their sons. Another mode of inheritance is Y-linked inheritance. And notice there's no dominant or recessive written with this one because, again, men only have an X and one Y. So it doesn't really matter if the trait is dominant or recessive because there's only one of them. If the gene is located on this chromosome, the man will be affected. Only males are affected because females do not have a Y chromosome. All sons of an affected male will also be affected. What makes a son is that he inherited his father's Y chromosome. And in this case, it's affected. Females can't possess these traits. They can't pass on the traits. But fathers will pass them to every son, but to no daughters. That's the Y-linked mode of inheritance. A lot of people don't realize that you have 46 chromosomes inside the nucleus of your cells, but you have another chromosome that's extranuclear. You have another chromosome that's located in the mitochondria. Something else that a lot of people don't realize is that your mitochondrial chromosome is always inherited from your mother. You get most of your organelles from your mother. You get 23 nuclear chromosomes from mom, 23 nuclear chromosomes from dad, but you also get this 24th chromosome, in this case the mitochondrial one, from your mother. So the way mitochondrial traits are inherited, they're always inherited from the mother. They usually affect metabolism. All of the children of an affected female will express the trait. Again, you only have one version of the mitochondrial chromosome. Doesn't matter if it's dominant or recessive because there's only one of them. If you have that chromosome, you will be affected by all the genes on it. Males can express these traits, but they can't pass them on. And again, that's because you inherit your mitochondrial chromosome from your mother. So when you're looking at a pedigree chart for a mitochondrial trait, you're going to see that females who are affected give the trait, they pass the trait to every child. Affected males pass the trait to no children. Now we're going to look at a few pedigree charts, and we're going to try to determine the mode of inheritance of each one. I have two questions I want you to answer when you look at a pedigree chart. First of all, I want you to look to see if, number one, if there are any carriers marked, or if the trait skips generations. If either one of those is true, if there are carriers, or if the trait skips generations, that should tell you that the trait's recessive. So again, are there carriers, or are generations skipped? If the answer to either one of those questions is yes, that indicates recessive. So if we look at this pedigree chart, here's generation number 1, generation number 2, generation number 3. There are no marked carriers. Now sometimes carriers won't be marked, but also this trait does not skip any generations. So that should lead us to believe that the trait is dominant. The second thing that I want you to look at are males and females affected at equal frequencies. So just go through and count. We have 3 affected males, 4 affected females, so it looks pretty close. If males and females are affected with equal frequency, most of the time the trait's going to be autosomal because it has nothing to do with gender. So we're going to guess that the mode of inheritance of this one is autosomal and dominant. And let's see if I can make a little room and write that a little bit better here. So autosomal, dominant. Now, one thing we can check is let's look to see who can pass the trait on to whom. This guy, notice, passes it to a daughter here and to a daughter there. But he also passes it to a son. This female passes it to a daughter, to a son. This male passes it to a daughter. So we're seeing that men can pass it to men can pass it to women can pass it to men can pass it to women. There is male-to-male transmission. So in this case, that eliminates for us X-linked dominant and X-linked recessives. Y-linked is also eliminated because females are affected. So there's a good chance the mode of inheritance for this first pedigree chart is autosomal and dominant. All right, here's our second pedigree chart. And again, we first of all want to look, are there carriers? Does the trait skip a generation? And again, the answer to both of those questions is no. Remember, if we get an answer of no to those two questions, typically we're looking at a trait that's dominant. The next thing we want to look at are men and women affected with equal frequency. If we just go through and count, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 affected men. We have 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 affected females. So females are affected much more often than men. If that is true, typically the mode of inheritance is going to be X-linked. So we're going to say this trait is X-linked dominant. Now just to make sure, let's look at who can pass the trait on to whom. This father passes it to daughter, daughter, daughter. Passes it to every daughter. But notice, he does not pass it to sons. Affected females can pass to daughters and sons. You see that all over the chart. Men, though, are passing it to every daughter. That's a good indication of an X-linked dominant trait. An affected man will pass it to every daughter, but none of his sons. Affected females can pass the trait to daughters or sons. So the mode of inheritance for pedigree chart number 2, X-linked and dominant. All right, here's pedigree chart number 3. And again, our first question, are there carriers? Does the trait skip generations? And we can see in the very first 2 generations that both of those questions, the answer to both of them is true. Yes. There's a carrier here, female carrier, a male carrier, no affected individuals in generation 1. There's also carriers in generation 2, but no actually affected individuals. And then in generation 3, we get our 1 affected individual right there. So again, there are carriers. That tells us that the trait is recessive. Then we look, are males and females affected equally? And what we see is the only affected individual is a male. So that should tell us, well, let's go a little bit further before we say that. We notice that female carrier, male carrier, male carrier, female carrier, male carrier. If there are conditions where you, in pedigrees, where you have males who are carrying a trait and females who are carrying a trait, the trait can't be X-linked. Men can't carry X-linked traits. Since they only have 1 X chromosome, they either exhibit the trait or they don't have it at all. So in this case, this trait must be autosomal and recessive. So again, because both males and females can carry the trait, because it skips generations and there are carriers, this particular trait seems to be autosomal and recessive. All right, here's pedigree number 4. Again, we ask our first question. Are there carriers? Does the trait skip a generation? Notice there are lots of carriers. All of these circled individuals are carriers. Also notice that all of generation 2 is skipped. There are no individuals that are affected in generation number 2. There is an individual in number 1 affected. There are several individuals in generation 3 affected. There are also some in generation 4 affected. But since there are carriers and since generations are skipped, this trait is a recessive trait. And then we answer our second question, are males and females affected with equal frequency? And what we see that almost every affected male, almost every affected individual rather, is male. Almost all the carriers, or all the carriers in this case, are female. When the male to female ratios are off, the trait is going to be sex-linked. And in this case, we're looking at a trait that is X-linked. Whenever you have a trait, when males are being affected fairly often, females are not affected very often at all, but carry the trait. In most cases, that particular trait is an X-linked recessive trait. All right, this one's our last pedigree example for the day. This pedigree chart often confuses people. I want to point out a couple things to you about it first. First of all, down here, we're looking at a set of fraternal twins. Remember this dashed line, or this triangle-shaped connection there tells us that we're looking at twins. We know they're fraternal because one's a male and one's a female. They can't be identical. We ask our questions about our pedigree. Are there carriers, or does the trait skip a generation? And we see that there don't seem to be any carriers, and that every generation, 1, 2, and 3, has affected individuals. So typically that would tell us that the trait's dominant. Let's look a little bit more closely in this one. This one's a unique one. Are males and females affected equally is the next question that we usually would ask. And we see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 affected males, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 affected females. So the ratio is pretty close. So a lot of people would stop there, and they would write down the mode of inheritance as autosomal and dominant. Dominant because there are no carriers and no skipping of a generation, and autosomal because the male to female ratio of affected individuals seems to be about the same. But here's one where you have to pay close attention to the details. Autosomal dominant is not the mode of inheritance for this trait. Before you completely determine the mode of inheritance, you want to make sure you look at who can pass the trait to who. And what we see in this particular example, this affected female in generation number 1 passes the trait on to every one of her children. Individual 2 is not her child. She is the spouse of a son. Individual 4 is not one of her children. He's the spouse of one of her daughters, and so on. So the female is giving it to every child. Now let's go a little bit further. Let's look at a generation 2, person number 1. So this guy, he's affected, but notice that none of his children get the trait. Let's look at person number 3 in generation 2. She's affected, and notice that every child of hers is affected. Person number 5 in generation 2, he has it, none of his children get it. Person number 7, she has it, all of her children get it. So the pattern that should clue you in that you're looking at a mitochondrial trait, affected females pass the trait on to every child. Affected males pass the trait on to no children. So the mode of inheritance here, this is mitochondrial inheritance. All right, I hope this gave you a better understanding of how to look at a pedigree and to determine the mode of inheritance of a trait from the pedigree chart.